In 1417, a case came before commissioners appointed by the Crown concerning a figure who called himself not Robin Hood but Friar Tuck, along with, quote, other evildoers and breakers of the peace. These men had apparently broken into various parks and hunting grounds in Suffolk and Surrey and engaged in intensive poaching, arson and violent threat towards the gamekeepers. I'm Hannah Skoda. I'm a Fellow in Medieval History at St John's College in Oxford, where I teach and research late medieval history. And this is a History Extra Academy course on late medieval England. And today I'm going to be lecturing about crime, violence and the law. So in the last lecture, we discussed the importance of community in late medieval England. Communities were in flux in this period, but they were also marked by strong mutual support. But unfortunately, communities were also beset by high levels of crime and violence. But this was by no means a society inured to violence. Not at all. The truth remains, though, that levels of homicide and violent crime were extremely high. Statistics are obviously really fraught with problems, frustratingly. There was no real police force in this period. Definitions of violence were different, so that many actions that we might deem criminal went unprosecuted. The records are really problematic, and so on. So actually establishing numbers is very difficult. But one of the most wonderful recent resources is called the Medieval Murder Map, put together by some colleagues at the University of Cambridge. And it gives a terrifying sense of the sheer frequency of fatal violence in a trio of English cities, Oxford, London and York. And we can find that just outside the window of my office here in St John's College in Oxford, a very unpleasant series of events happened in the early 14th century.
On Tuesday, before the feast of St Gregory the Pope, Robert de Brantwyth, clerk, died in his lodging in the parish of Holy Cross in the suburb of Oxford about the 9th hour. On the following day, he was viewed by John Wyth, King's coroner of the town of Oxford. He had one wound on the top of his head, 5 inches in length, and in depth even to the brain. Immediately afterwards, an inquest was held by the oath of sworn men of the parishes of St Mary Magdalene, Holy Cross, St Michael North and St Mary the Virgin. The jury say upon their oath that late on Sunday before the feast of St Matthias the Apostle, Robert de Brantwyth stood in the High Street before the shop of Roger le Barber in the parish of St Mary Magdalene in the suburb of Oxford. And Henry le Petit, a mancipal dwelling at Well Hall, and Thomas de Fenton, clerk, came there and assaulted Robert because of a strife that was between them and Robert. Henry struck him with a sword and gave him a wound on the head. He lived through 8 days and a half after he was wounded and obtained all ecclesiastical rights. The jurors say that Thomas de Fenton was consenting and aiding to his death. Thomas at once fled so that he could not be secured, nor could anything be discovered about his goods. Later, Henry was arrested by the bailiff of the said hundred for this appearance in the hundred outside of the North Gate of Oxford. He remains in prison.
There's a lot to learn from this case about late medieval crime, violence and law. We get a sense of the sheer bloodiness of medieval and particularly student life. We learn that most often multiple perpetrators were involved, in this case at least Henry and Thomas. We learn that interpersonal quarrels could easily turn fatal. We learn that many people were carrying knives around with them. And we learned that attacks could often wound someone so they died some days later, presumably because medical interventions were really ineffective in this period. We also learn about the spaces of violence. This is a highly public event, starting in the High Street in front of the shop of Roger le Barber. but we also learn about the ways in which crime was dealt with. This was not just a lawless gangster society where people could beat each other up with impunity. The response of the law was clear. This kind of violence was unacceptable, and it was a threat to the well-being of the wider community. The inquest was held by a group of men from various local parishes. So there's a clear sense that the worthy men of the community were responsible for dealing with this issue. Violence was not just a matter for top-down law, though. Communities were involved in policing too. And obviously this is crucial in a period when we don't have a police force to speak of. And communities are heavily involved in medieval punishment. This is how medieval punishment works. The stocks, for example, a popular medieval punishment for petty misdemeanours, depended on the cooperation of the community in the humiliation of the accused. You need people to throw stuff at people in the stocks, and you need people to laugh at them and to ridicule them, otherwise there's no point. But this was also a period of the growth of royal law. It's a period of lots and lots of different kinds of law. It's a bit dizzying, frankly. We have canon law, the law of the church. We have the customary law of localities. We have manorial law of local manors governing behaviour on manors. We have forest law, the law of the forest areas governing hunting rights and common rights. But more and more cases came before King's Bench. This was the ultimate royal court. And these cases were those which were deemed to be a breach of the king's peace. In other words, there was an increasing sense in this period that a growing number of offences challenged the well-being of society as a whole, not just the individuals involved. And law was becoming more and more sophisticated to deal with this kind of thing. A crucial early text is that of Ranulph de Glanville, entitled Tractatus de Legibus et Consuetudinibus Regni Angliae. So it's a tract on the laws and customs of the Kingdom of England. And this is largely a practical guide to the King's Court. This is about royal law. Second key text is the 13th century compilation of common law by Henry de Bracton, also called On the Laws and Customs of the English. Bracton's text is really interesting because it intertwines Roman law, the law mainly used in continental Europe, with customary law in order to elucidate the kinds of law exercised in royal courts. Bracton's also notable for exploring the idea of mens rea, the idea of criminal intent, and its importance in determining the results of a case. So this is a period when royal law, King's Bench are dealing with more and more cases, and the sophistication of this is growing dramatically. What kinds of cases attracted the attention of the royal courts? So it's mostly a case of the gravity of the offence. The king was the fount of justice, after all. He's responsible for assuring the common good of the kingdom. And it also involved protecting outsiders. Janus Imperial was a merchant from Genoa in Italy, working in London, and he was murdered in August 1376. The perpetrators, a mercer and grocer, claimed that it was a random scuffle in front of Janus Imperial's residence and that it was provoked by someone treading on someone else's foot. And the very idea of this gives you a sense just how dangerous medieval society is. You needed to be very careful walking down the street. But the crime was eventually deemed not just a breach of the king's peace, but actually treasonous. Because Janus Imperial, like so many merchants who'd come to England, had letters patent assuring him of the king's protection. Merchants from abroad often met with hostile reactions, but the official line was to welcome them. This was a society dependent on international connections and travel. The Chronicle of Sir Thomas Walsingham tells us that Janus Imperial actually had a much greater mission on behalf of the Genoese city-state. He was supposed to establish Southampton as a preeminent port of trade with Italy. So there's a really interesting, slightly secretive backstory here. Diplomacy and commerce overlapped dramatically. So the murder of Janus Imperial laid bare the dependence on trading relations and the importance of this to the English crown. This was emphatically a matter for King's Bench. It's a case which reminds us that royal law was ever more present and that its role was to protect the well-being of the kingdom, including its commercial relations. But despite this royal law, communities really mattered. What I find most extraordinary about this period is the sheer wealth of understanding and consciousness of law right across the social spectrum. The Janus Imperial case is also a reminder that law was complex and that people knew how to manipulate it and also how to try to make it work for them. So the case gets even more complicated and starts to reveal deep-rooted tensions. Londoners were very reluctant to allow the prosecution of the perpetrators. The scholar Paul Strome has done some careful detective work to reveal a conspiracy against Janus Imperial by wool merchants who were keen to protect their privileges. So the case actually reveals a whole context of people using both the violence of the case itself, but also the legal reaction to try to manipulate these relationships. Law continued to depend on communities. This was partly because of the role of juries. There's often a disjunction between the categories of the law and the messy complexity of social life. And jurors were able to act as mediators between the two, and in doing so, to impose their own understandings of what was going on, their own community-based understandings. A famous example lies in the lack of a clear distinction in medieval law between murder and manslaughter. The scholar T.A. Green has demonstrated that jurors found ways to create such a distinction in the ways that they presented cases. So jurors in this period aren't just invited to judge the facts, they are fact finders, so they're supposed to present the case in a particular way. Even if the letter of the law did not provide for ways of articulating a gradated concept of intention with manslaughter and murder, jurors themselves in practice applied such understandings, and thus de facto, if not de jure, created distinct categories. So here then we've got a really clear sense both of communities nuancing and complicating law, and of communities thinking through the implications of interpersonal violence in sophisticated and nuanced ways. A strange quirk of late medieval law was the practice of sanctuary. This meant that a convicted felon could seek sanctuary in an ecclesiastical building for 40 days. It doesn't mean that ecclesiastical authorities were trying to undermine secular law. It's sometimes interpreted as such, but this is not what's going on, not least because once the 40 days are up, that's it for the felon. But it does suggest a sense that the messy complexity of life did not always correspond to the neat categories of law, and that people realised this. The practice of sanctuary was completely dependent on the cooperation of communities. Those who sought sanctuary needed people to bring them food and drink, after all. After the 40 days were up, the convicted had to abjure the realm. They were outlaws. So this sense of community investment in law, even in the face of growing royal law, And this sense that people realised that law didn't quite map on to life produced humour as well. I think we should never forget that people in the Middle Ages had a sense of humour and they liked to have fun. This is a period of the very earliest versions of the Robin Hood stories. The first manuscripts date from the 14th century, although the stories get much more complex and detailed later on. There's a huge debate amongst scholars as to whether these stories were intended as radical and subversive. Certainly they challenged the legal process, or whether they were intended simply as entertainment. I think the answer must be that they were both. They bear witness to people's intense awareness of the growth of law, of its potential injustices, but also of what law could do for them. And alongside the Robin Hood stories, we also have a handful of references in legal documents to individuals describing themselves as characters from the stories. So we could choose to take this at face value and assume there's lots of people called Robin Hood in this period, but I think it's more likely that these stories are circulating and people are choosing to use the name in order to make a point. In 1417, a case came before commissioners appointed by the Crown concerning a figure who called himself not Robin Hood but Friar Tuck, along with, quote, other evildoers and breakers of the peace. These men had apparently broken into various parks and hunting grounds in Suffolk and Surrey and engaged in intensive poaching, arson and violent threat towards the gamekeepers.
We are given to understand that a certain person assuming the unusual name of Friar Tuck and other evildoers and breakers of the peace, armed and arrayed in manner of war, have entered with force and arms parks, warrens and chases of various of our lieges in the counties of Surrey and Sussex at various times without licence and of their own free will, hunted therein and carried off deer, hares, rabbits, pheasants and partridges, and burned the houses and lodges for the keepers of the parks, warrens and chases, and threatened the keepers with death or bodily mutilation.
It's a fascinating case, and it turns out that it actually involved a chaplain called Robert Stafford. So by describing himself as Friar Tuck, Stafford had fun and entertained, but he also elevated what he was doing into a challenge to the unfairness of, in this case, forest law, the law which excluded common people from the rights of the forest, the rights to hunting. So Robert Stafford, by presenting himself as Friar Tuck, turned an act of petty theft into an act of social justice. And by burning houses and threatening keepers, he took upon himself the role of the law. He claimed that he was the one upholding the well-being of the wider community. And all this was possible because people knew about the law. They understood its intricacies, its inequities, but also its opportunities.